Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we currently have 2 applications out for the King's Indian on iPhone and on Android. Check them out. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a Blitz game as part of our Blitz series. In this game, I gained a tremendous advantage in the Petrov's defense, one of my favorite defenses. We'll leave the result for surprise. Let's take a look. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a game that I played on chess.com. It's a Blitz game, and I was rated about 60 points higher than my opponent. The game began with pawn to e4, pawn to e5. I'm handling the black pieces. Knight to f3 was played, and now I replied with the move knight to f6, ushering in a position known as the Petrov's defense. And this is actually one of my favorite openings for black. For some strange reason, I just get a kick out of playing these slightly defensive positions with not a whole lot going on, perhaps creating a little frustration for the opponent, but I'm a nice guy. I'm not really trying to frustrate the opponent. I just get pleasure out of defending. So white plays knight takes e5, I play d6, knight comes back to f3, I capture on e4, and now we reach a quite normal position in the Petrov's defense where white has an option. He can either play d4, which for a long time was basically the only main move in this position, or white can play knight to c3, which has recently become quite popular, maybe even more popular than d4. With knight to c3, white's idea is that after knight takes c3, d takes c3, he's going to flush these bishops out. Notice that his bishops have a little bit easier time getting out because black's bishop on f8 is somewhat blocked by the d6 pawn. So white's bishops flush out quite quickly. The queen generally comes out to d2 after the bishop comes out, let's say to e3 or to f4. Queen comes out, white castles, and then oftentimes white is looking to create a kind of attack on the king side, especially if black's king castles on that side. And typically, if black has castled king side, he'll want to try to attack white's queen side, but these pawns, these doubled pawns, actually help to kind of bolster up white's king front, and so this makes it a little bit more difficult for black to succeed with his queen side attack. In my opinion, these positions are still not that difficult for black to defend if he's aware of the different resources at hand, but it is somewhat annoying. Instead, white played the more normal move, pawn to d4. Black typically plays pawn to d5. Bishop to d3 was played. And now this is going to be white's argument for the advantage in the Petrov's defense. What white will go ahead and argue here is that sooner or later, black is going to have to move this knight away from e4. He's either going to have to retreat it, or he's going to have to protect it if white starts to overpower it with other pieces, or he'll have to trade it for another piece. And in the process, black normally finds that he goes down a little bit in time, a little bit in development, and then white can start working with that slight development advantage. So I continued with bishop d6. There are other lines available here, but this is just a blitz game, so I'll show what happened relatively quickly. Castles, castles. And now, instead of the main move, pawn to c4, which is definitely the correct move here, my opponent played knight to c3, which I don't think is such a good idea before he's played the move pawn to c4. So I capture on c3, he captures on c3. So, in this position, white has managed to get a little bit of extra development here because he's got 2 minor pieces out, whereas black only has 1 minor piece out. And he could argue that this pawn might play a role in creating some pressure against the center, and the b file might end up being important for him. So all those arguments are there. However, at the same time, he's inflicted himself with some doubled pawns here, and it's only going to be a matter of time before black finishes development. Again, I really enjoy these kinds of positions because if black is skillful in extinguishing the development advantage that white has in this position, sooner or later it's bound to occur that black finds himself in an equal situation and then he may be able to profit long-term from the weaknesses of the pawns. So I continued pawn to c6. A recommendation made by the computer afterwards was pawn to c5, also a good move. So I played pawn to c6, knight to g5. This is simply bizarre. h6 was played. Queen to h5, so he's going all out for an attack here. But then with simply some basic calculation, I was able to find just, okay, move pawn to f5 is fine here. Knight d7 was also possible. Of course, black doesn't want to take on g5 because of queen to h7 mate. So after queen h5, I played pawn to f5. White retreats the knight to h3. I played queen to c7. White played f4. I played knight to d7. And from here, it's pretty safe to say that it's not white who has a slight advantage, but black who has a slight advantage, because this queen is likely to be disturbed at any time. This knight is on its way to e4, and white's knight, if you look very carefully, is quite a ways away from being able to infiltrate the neighboring square on e5, or the converse square on e5. So, to put that quite simply, black is going to be able to make use of his e4 square, but white is going to have a hard time getting that knight out to the e5 square, which is what he would like to do. So I played knight d7, white continued bishop d2, knight f6, naturally, queen g6, knight e4, here comes that visitor, rook a to d1, queen to f7. I'm more than happy to start simplifying the position. Again, I believe in my chances of simply working with this pawn structure, and also with this advanced knight on e4, the pressure on the bishop on d2, so now I have a much better position. White captured. I captured with the king. Very interesting choice. Simply preparing to bring the king up to f6 or g6 or e6, and this rook doesn't miss the fact that it didn't come to f7, because it's likely to find play perhaps on the e8 square. So king takes f7, g3, king f6, bishop takes e4, d takes e4. Now I've got the bishop pair, I've got a passed pawn, and I've got some weaknesses to work with in this position. Excellent situation. c4, bishop e6, immediately taking advantage of my light squared bishop, which is uncontested. Not only does he not have a light squared bishop, but keep in mind this knight is completely out of the game at the moment. c5, bishop to e7, rook a1, a5. I didn't have a whole lot of time in this position, and so I just started making some moves which looked like it was progress. So ideally this pawn makes it up to the a3 square, and then the rook can come to a4, and I can start shoveling my rooks over on the queen side and creating some counterplay with this method. So a5, he played a3, I played a4, and now he played rook f to b1. I defended the pawn. He played rook to b6. And now I like this move, bishop to c4, which is simply preparing to bring the bishop back to b5 as a way of trapping this rook on the b6 square and also blockading. If he plays this rook here, bishop to b5, and those rooks are all blocked up. And next move, I'll probably play bishop to d8. c4 could be interesting here. And I did not have a solution worked out, but I have some options. I can either capture and allow the exchange here, and then look at what I have available in this position, or I could simply retreat the bishop, and then on the next move, play rook to a7, adding a second defender. Gotta be careful about that because of rook takes c6 check. So in fact, I wouldn't be doing that. I would probably be playing bishop d8, swinging the king over to c7 or c8, in order to add an extra defender to b7, and then only then actualizing this bishop's potential. But probably, it seems to me that bishop to b5, c4, we probably would have to take this pawn. So rook b6 certainly looks playable in this position, but instead after bishop c4, he played rook to b4, and this is a terrible move. This allowed me to play pawn to b5 right away, taking advantage of this pin, because after c takes b6, I have bishop takes b4. Now, if he doesn't capture the pawn on b6, look at this crushing setup. All of his play has been stopped here. The bishop is wonderfully perched on c4. This bishop is headed over to a5, and we have real good chances of creating some play in this position. But interestingly, my opponent actually played c takes b6. I captured the rook. He recaptured the bishop. I captured the pawn. Now I'm up in exchange in this position. c3, a3, king f2, a2, bishop to c1. And now, with the time pressure, I started struggling to find the correct plan. This is not too bad what I played. Bishop to d3, king e3, bishop b1, making sure that that pawn is defended forever. Bishop to b2, rook to d8. But around here, the best plan was simply to start bringing the king over towards the pawn and then start destabilizing the situation with that bishop and pawn. But I simply did not see this plan. I was struggling with the time pressure. He played knight to f2, and then I played this move, pawn to c5, just trying to open up some files and create play. But this started to backfire on me. After d takes c5, rook to b7, king to e2. Still kind of nice that the king is cut off on this d file, but he does have all these pawns kind of staring my position down as well. So I played rook b d7. He played bishop c1. Again, struggling with time pressure, I just threw this rook into d3, offering it as a sacrifice in order to gain some play in the position, trying to get my rook in here, infiltrating. He played bishop d2. I'm still winning this position. King e6. Because notice, his rook is completely out of play here. Bishop e1, king d5, bishop d2, king c4, bishop e1. But now, for the life of me, I won't understand why I played the move pawn to e3. Perhaps I was trying to zugzwang him with this bishop. But now he played c6, and I started to have some problems figuring out how to reply quickly enough. Instead, had I just played the move king b3, c6, rook d6, b5, and now actually there's bishop d3 check. This I had missed, and so I can pick up the b5 pawn, and then there's no threat of him promoting any pawns. Also, it seems to me that king b2, well, king b2 won't work here because of c7. So the key was to see this bishop d3 check here, and that I missed. So instead of playing king b3, I played pawn to e3. He played c6. And now I blundered. I could again play the move rook to d6, winning. But instead, I played king to b5. He played c7. I have no way to stop the pawn. I played rook d7. He promoted into a queen, and I actually flagged. So a bummer outcome to this game, as black definitely had a winning position, but I failed to convert it. Now, what can we learn from this game? On the positive side, as far as I was concerned as a competitor, I managed to get that Petrov thing to work very well for me. My opponent made a couple of slight mistakes in the opening, playing way too aggressively with knight g5 and queen h5. Very quickly, I got a better position, and with some more help from my opponent, I got a crushing position on the queen side and later a full exchange thanks to a blunder on his part. However, my endgame technique and my awareness of the board as a whole could have definitely used some help, as my moves like c5 and some of these blunders I made right towards the end were not helpful at all, and I must have used too much time at some stage in the game because I simply didn't manage to produce the desired result from the winning position. However, I hope that this video has been entertaining, that you've learned a little bit from the explanations here, as well as some of the strategy, and a little bit about the Petrov's defense and how it operates. And that's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, if you have an opportunity, be sure to check out that we have 3 applications available on the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Check them out.